South Australia have also faced the intrusion and destruction of uranium mining and the threat of nuclear waste dumps on First Nations land. Port Augusta has long been a hub of resistance led by First Nations people in response to all parts of the nuclear industry. So it's my absolute pleasure to pass over to Karina and our panellists today.
Good evening, everyone, and it's lovely to be joining you all here from Port Augusta, South Australia. We want to thank Vienna for this amazing opportunity for us to be coming in and crossing over to Vienna to hear our stories and South Australia's stories of our resistance against this and how these nuclear weapons have harmed us. So joining me this evening, I have Aunty Sue Coleman-Haseldine, her granddaughter Mia Haseldine, and myself, 3 generations of strong campaigners against this. There are 2 ambassadors of ICAN that are joining us, myself and Aunty Sue, who have done this work over the years, joining ICAN, and we are very grateful for this opportunity. I want to start by asking Aunty Sue if she could tell us a little bit about her story and her amazing work with ICAN. I'll hand it over to you, Aunty Sue.
Thank you, Karina. Hello, Vienna. I was over there with you in 2014. I did a speech there. Wish I was there with you today. My name is Sue Coleman-Haseldine. I'm a Kokatha woman from the far west coast of South Australia. I was a child when the first atomic bombs at Maralinga were sent off. And I've been campaigning with ICAN now for a long time. I've been one of their ambassadors and proud to be so. I was so proud when we won the Nobel Peace Prize. That was a big win for the world, I think. We have been suffering over the years with different defects and different illnesses that were never used to be around before the atomic bombs were tested in our country. It's pretty hard to accept the fact that Australia will not ratify the treaty. I know Australia is at Vienna this time, and it would be good if they came home and told the government we owe the people of Australia something. We owe them protection for the future. We need to ban all things nuclear. So I will pass you back to Karina now, I think, because I've said a lot of things over the years. I'll give the young ones a chance.
Thanks, Aunty Sue. We're really grateful because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there are 3 generations before you speaking from Port Augusta about our stories and how these weapons have impacted on us. And for generations as before us, we have campaigned strong against this. With hearing the stories of Aunty Sue, and we know Aunty Sue's story as a family, but also myself as a 2nd generation survivor as well. My late father, Yankunytjatjara Lester, was instrumental in the campaign, but also in the work of the Royal Commission into the British nuclear testing. He's a survivor of the Emu Fields tests that happened in October 1953. He spoke up very strong in the Royal Commission about how his people, Arnangu from the Arnangu, Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara lands, have been affected and impacted by the radiation fallout that happened over our Wallatina community. And this story is a global story, and we hear that with the many stories that we have shared over the years and hearing from many of survivors and people who have experienced this, that it's a very common story around this globe of how catastrophic these weapons really are. And it's that lived experience that we continue on generations to continue those stories and remind everybody of what happened to Aboriginal people here in South Australia. Emu Fields tests were the first mainland tests that happened in Australia. That location at Emu Fields was a very remote location, and so the government of the day made the decision to move to Maralinga and continue their testing program on the grounds of Maralinga. And so many Arnongal, Aboriginal people of the Western Desert region, but also others around the surrounding areas, the Kokatha people, but also Yankunytjatjara people, people in the west around the WA area, were largely impacted by those tests that happened at Maralinga. And these stories are very present today in the generations that follow. Emu fields, because of that very isolating or isolation of that location, they moved down to Maralinga, closer to the railway line, creating that path of transportation as well. This is a real story that has impacted on Arnongal communities around South Australia. We hear through our own Arnongal history how this has impacted on our people, how many of our loved ones died from those tests that happened in the 50s and 60s, but also how our country has suffered a great deal as well. So it's really important as we continue on our work with ICAN to remind everyone of those stories of what happened in the 50s and in the 60s in South Australia's own backyard. These stories need to be continued on for generations to come to know exactly what happened to our people. For us to have our voice and know that our voice is surrounded by companions like all of you in Vienna who know the stories, who are there to share your stories and to hear our stories as well. We are grateful for this opportunity, and I want to bring in Mia as a third generation survivor as well to share a little of her story and how these nuclear weapons have impacted on her generation as well. Can I hand it over to you, Mia, to share?
Thank you, Karina. Thank you, Nana, for that awesome intro. So my name is Mia Haseldine. I'm a 29-year-old Kokatha woman from Ceduna. I'm the granddaughter of Sue, and everybody knows Nana Sue. She does so many campaigning, and she's done it since I was a little girl. I was attending meetings with her, and when I was a little girl attending, I never thought that I would be up here following in her footsteps and that I would have a personal story that links to this nuclear disaster. But here I am. So I've been born into this family who have had to fight. We've had to fight for so many things regarding our livelihood, regarding our Aboriginal culture. And an activist is not something that I thought I would ever have to call myself. When I was 16 years old leaving school, I just thought I would go be a nurse, be a midwife. That was my goal. And instead of having a career that I wanted, or having, a home, a husband, or a simple, quiet, humble life, I am a single mum. I carry post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. The PTSD I carry is caused from a genetic complication that meant my daughter developed tuber-shaped growths and tumours in her kidneys, her heart, and her brain, all whilst she was in utero. She was still in my stomach growing. There's no external factors that contributed to it, which means it was genetic, which means that our DNA has been mutated. Everything Nana fought for when I was a little girl, I had no idea it was going to lead to this. And she knew, she had a feeling, and it was right. And so now I'm here. There's not a day where I do not wonder how my life would be if she was still here with me. And I'm so glad and humbled that I can be here, a part of ICAN. And so today we're talking about prohibiting these nuclear weapons so that this can't keep happening. So I call on our Australian government and other countries, other governments, councils around Australia, I call on you all to prohibit the destruction and the trauma that these weapons leave behind. Not just for the people who were on the site or in close proximity, but to anyone who's been around a nuclear incident, because the bombings that happen here in Australia, they're not the only nuclear incidents, there are many. So educate yourselves. The information is out there. For all the following generations and all the unborn children, Australia needs to move, and so do other countries. We shouldn't have to fear another nuclear weapon being used on a country. I don't want another woman, another brother, another sister, another man, another family to experience the loss and the wonder or the doubt that did I lose my daughter because it is from fallout, or is it just something that happened? Like, I shouldn't have to doubt that. I feel like our Australian government should be contributing to research. They should be committing to understanding if there is genetic impacts on our people here in Australia. I don't know where to go with what I'm talking about. I wonder if my sisters or my sons, when they grow up, if they have children, is there going to be more of our babies that are born with tumours, and are they going to have to suffer the grief that is felt that I carry? My daughter would be 4 years old right now. And it has affected me immensely. It's affected my children and my family. We've all been affected by her loss. And I wonder if there are more stories out there like mine that they don't know that it could be from DNA mutations. There's always this thought that that's what it could be, and we don't know the facts, because I feel like it needs to be researched and understood here in Australia. And that's what I asked for. And I know and I understand that security and defence is important in today's world. I get that. But I think nuclear is not the answer. And I will give back to you guys.
Thank you, Mia. I really appreciate it, and we can't help but be moved by those stories, because it is a generational story, and we all know, those of us that have been fighting this fight, it has been a generational story. The journey has filtered down generations to generations, and as I've mentioned before you, there are 3 generations here who continue the fight. Those who have come from lived experience of those British nuclear tests, whether it be at Emu Fields or whether it be down at Maralinga, those lived experience are very real experiences. We also are generations that are second generation survivors who have seen what these tests have taken away. Our fathers' eyesights, they have burnt the skins of our loved ones, of our grandmothers, of our grandfathers. They have taken away the lives of our loved ones. And we just heard Mia talk about the next generation and how they have been robbed their life to continue on and to know this story as well. And so it is an ongoing, painful story, but a story that we all must continue to remind governments of the day, to remind everybody the stories that happened and the horrors that happened to our people, what happened in South Australia, what happened across the globe, as governments have made choices to test, to use these weapons to do harm on our country, but also harm on our people. And we will know those stories, we all know those stories of Habakasha, who first-hand experienced what these weapons can do. And these are moving stories, but we all need to continue to get those stories out to the broader community, to remind not only ourselves, but also the broader community of how these weapons have impacted on us. Aunty Sue, if there was something we would say, if we were in Vienna, what would we want the world to know about these catastrophic weapons, and what would we want the government to know?
Firstly, I would like to acknowledge places like Japan, Kazakhstan, the Marshall Islands. Now, I've met people from those places that have suffered as we have. And, you've really got my heart. I'd like the government to understand just what they're doing. It's not just... I've lived my life, and I've lived through all this horrible poisonous stuff. I don't want to see my grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry it on, my children. So what I'd like to see is that we have to keep the past alive. We really do, so we can protect the future. Because if we're going to forget that past, they're going to do it again, and it's going to start all over again, and the future will be just nothing but a nuclear black cloud hanging over everybody. So please, Australia, sign and ratify the treaty, and let's all work together to get rid of this monstrous weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you, Aunty Sue. I think that's really encouraging to hear, and it's a strong message, no doubt, coming out of Vienna as well, about other countries around this globe who may not have signed on and ratified this treaty, but the amazing work of ICAN, who have done years and years of work in developing this, and everyone who have been involved in pulling this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and the articles that are there very strong for us all to work on. And Articles 6 and 7 are very important for us who are survivors and generational survivors of what happened here in Australia, and in our own backyard here in South Australia as well. One of the important messages from Port Augusta is really reminding everybody about what happened and the generations that have felt the impacts. I've spoken a little bit of language in this presentation this evening from Port to talk about how our mob, Yankunytjatjara-Anangu, were not informed of those tests that were about to take place on their traditional lands. And language is front and centre in informing our own mob and bringing our own mob on our journey as we fight this fight. It's important for information to be in Bijanjara and Yankunytjatjara, for those languages to be valued, and also for Anangu to know of the impact it has on our bodies and our environment as well. It's important for Anangu to understand how these weapons are harmful, and how important it is for us to get our stories out in our own language, in our Bijanjara and Yankunytjatjara language as well. It's important because consent was never given by Yankunytjatjara. At emu fields, government did not come and ask Anangu, Bijanjara, Yankunytjatjara if it was okay to test on their traditional lands. And so we were never informed, Anangu were never informed of what the government was deciding behind closed doors. This is a huge story that needs to be shared, that Anangu need to know about these harms because we've lived what these weapons have done to our family, and our oral stories that are passed on generations to generations are the stories of that lived experience. Our loved ones died, our loved ones suffered, and we are the generations that continue to share those stories, but also feel how it has impacted on the generations to come as well. Mia touched on research, and I think that's a real important area. And I'm hoping, Mia, I could ask you if you wanted to elaborate a little bit more around the research that is needed for us here in South Australia and where they tested on Nana's country, and what are those gaps that you would like to see more being done for the next generation?
I think genetic research there's like heaps of research, and there's heaps of scientists and doctors already studying DNA. So I think if we could somehow link those scientists or researchers into people that live on community, eat food from this community, like we still eat the bush tucker that's out there where fallout probably landed. So I mean, I think coming to community researchers and just talking, I guess, gathering stories. You have to gather information from us. You have to understand and hear our stories. create rapport so that we open up and tell you. Like, there's probably other women who have stories similar to mine, but if they don't know that, you know, that fallout could have impacted genes or food or water in the area, then you can't make the connection, and you won't talk to someone about it, or you won't ask the questions. The only reason I ask the questions about my little girl is because my grandmother has been talking about this stuff for years, because a doctor talked to her about it years ago. So I know it because my grandmother tells me about it. And then it happening to me made me ask, where I probably wouldn't have asked if I didn't have any connection. And I think Australia should be committing to educating people so that they do ask the question, and that their stories can be heard and their stories can be shared and heard, like, and actually helped. So, I mean, if there is, like, people suffering with cancer that could be linked to the fallout, like, provide compensation, help. But compensation is not the biggest thing. I think we need healing, we need to be acknowledged that tests happened here. We need apologies. We need to be able to understand that we just need to be able to somehow heal through it. And I think, there's a long way to go, I think.
Absolutely. And it's so important as generations, and yourself being third generation survivor, to really continue on to talk about where those gaps are. You know, the research is such an important area because the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons focuses on those areas. The research and the support that is needed by communities is crucial, and we need governments of the day to really work with communities who have been impacted by this. Thank you both for sharing your painful stories over generations. As I mentioned, there are 3 generations here. Where do you find your hope and energy to keep doing this work despite such a heavy burden, you know, we all carry for you and your community? I'm going to ask you, Aunty Sue, you know, where does that, you know, your energy to keep going and keep going? I know you did say we give it to the young people to hand and take on, but how do we continue on despite such heavy burdens, of course?
There's been times when I just wanted to give up, and somehow I always stand up and say, no, you can't give up. You must keep going. You must help protect the young, the future generations, the animals, the world in general. And, you know, there's a message there. Just keep it going. And, you know, we really must put a stop to all things nuclear before nuclear puts a stop to the world. But that strength to keep going is coming from the fact that the future generations have got to survive. We need them. You know, like I said, I've lived my time. I'm old now, but Mia has followed through, and now she's stepping up, which we was hoping things like this wouldn't happen, you know, that we could all say, it's all fine, but it's not. Now, Mia's going to carry the fear that I carried all those years, and that was the fear of, did I pass down, you know, the mutated genes?
Yeah.
And yes, I did, because just in my own family, triple heart bypasses, thyroids, deformities, you know, that's just my own family. So how many other families out there worldwide who are suffering the same types of things, a bit scared to talk about the mutations and just in case it might happen, and it did. But, you know, how many families out there are afraid and holding it inside of them, not bringing it out, for just afraid for their future generations?
Yeah.
Well, I'm one of them.
I've heard stories of, you know, women being born without reproductive organs. Like, I feel like we're going to start hearing stories like that from our own community if, you know, and I think that really hurts, and that's really sad and scary.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the messages coming from Port Augusta's gathering is that our stories and hopes are stronger than your weapons and fears, and I think that's really strong in what we've heard this evening as well about keeping those stories alive and ongoing. I think it's important for us to find that hope and to find that energy to continue on, to share and keep these stories alive for generations to come. It is really important for us to continue on this work. It is a heavy burden, but with community behind us and community on board, community knowing our stories and feeling strong to share their stories, it's important for us to continue on to do that for our broader community, to bring greater awareness in our own broader community here in South Australia and Australia, but also across the world as well. It's so important to continue sharing those stories. What do you think is the most important to educate people about harms and ongoing needs? I'm going to ask you, Mia, that question about the most important education that's needed for people about the harms and ongoing needs within our communities and within our own, Kokatha community or Anangu community.
I think understanding that the atomic testing was actually not that long ago. That Nana was a little girl when she was around when it happened. So it wasn't that long ago, and I think people my age probably don't really know that much about it, or they may have heard little things, whereas there's not this understanding of what it was, who brought it, why it came to Australia, how big it was, and how the fallout actually spread, and then how it still has implications today. There's so much land that is untouchable and prohibited because it's still radioactive. And then the fact that it passes through generations, and so people that could have been in close proximity, it's now passed through, so they may have passed on, whereas the implications from that testing is still carrying through now, even though the test happened so long ago. And the important education around that needs to be that we know that we're taught what kind of mutations we have to look out for, or how can we tell what the signs are and what the symptoms are if we have been affected or if it has come through our genes. I think we don't understand fully.
And more education is needed around those areas of how it has impacted and harmed us as women, because it's a known fact that women and children are impacted by this through that ionising radiation, and how that filters through to the next generation, that we carry those to pass on to the next generation. They are big concerns, and education is no doubt, broad right across the communities, absolutely. It's important to remind everybody of those lived experiences and what we've gone through, how our people suffered with autoimmune diseases. We need that better education, as Mia spoken about and shared with us today. The research is needed, and the treaty touches on that, and we need good research across our state of South Australia on the harms of nuclear testing, but also on the harms on our environment as well. We as Aboriginal people, Anangu, Kokatha, Yankunytjatjara-Anangu, Yankunytjatjara-Anangu, still hunt and gather on our traditional lands. We need to know this story. We need to know how these weapons testings in the 50s and 60s have impacted on those traditional lands that we still continue to use today. We want to know that information. So we're going to ask the Australian government to allow for that research to happen, for us to know more information on how our environment and how people have been impacted by these British nuclear tests that happened in the 50s and 60s. It's important to continue those stories, as heavy burden it is on us and our community. It's crucial for us to continue on sharing those stories. It's important to educate the broader community as well, not only our own Anangu community, talking up in our own language, Yankunytjatjara language, but also the wider community of knowing how their state and our community has been impacted by this as well. asked you, Aunty Sue, before about the last message to the Australian government was to get them to sign and ratify this treaty.
Absolutely.
And that's important from the Kokatha community.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We're excited to know that Australia is being represented over there in Vienna. We are grateful that they and this government today have taken that initiative to send somebody over to hear our stories and to hear the stories of civil society, how this has impacted on our lives and on generations and generations. And this evening, we've got 3 generations before as well. So, Mia, I'll hand it over.
Knowing that we have an Australian senator over there, I want to specifically say if you can commit to putting toxic waste here in our ground, then you should be committing to the research and the impacts that have already happened here in regards to nuclear. I think that's just a duh moment. Like, commit and help and fix what has happened before you do it again with something related to nuclear as well. Yeah.
We've got a question that I want to hand over to you, Aunty Sue, because it's asking about how much do people in Australia know about the harm that happened in their own country? Do you think the education is getting out there to our community?
Look, it's still getting out there. They do not know. They do not understand. There are so many people that don't understand that, radiation is not prejudice. It doesn't care whether you're black, white, or brindle. They don't know. And the government has kept the Maralinga and Emu Fields and Montebello so secret that there's a lot of people that hadn't even heard of it still. And that's very wrong because all those people were impacted and they know nothing. There's cancers and everything is starting to hit really bad, heart attacks in young people, 30-year-olds. All this sort of stuff is happening and people are saying, why? How come this is going on? They do not know the impacts of what happened, what's, the possible causes of it, like the radiation fallout, and they do not understand about the genes being mutated down the line. They do not know. And it's very important that somehow we get the word out Australia-wide, because I'm keeping it going with my family, but it needs to get out Australia-wide and let them all know that the whole lot of us are impacted.
Absolutely. I think that's very important for us to be very educated around the harms of nuclear weapons and how it has impacted not only in our own families but also the broader community and what's happened in our own country as well. One last final one is just finding out, and it's a question I might hand over to you, Mia, about funds for research, providing funds for research with communities about the ongoing impacts and how to support families like yourself who have been affected by this as well. Should the government be responsible and support families like yourselves to research it?
Definitely. Yeah, they need to research. I've said that, but they also need to, I think, put supports in communities so that education is happening within the community and that it's understandable. So, like you talk about the Pitjantjatjara lands, it needs to be in your language where you are, but it needs to be understandable in our community, back in Ceduna, Port Lincoln, wherever you are. Like it needs to be understood in the community that it's at. But also, I think so my little girl, her grave doesn't have a headstone. That's something really physical that they could be helping support if it is to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that those things are important from us as a family who have gone through this experience. Something as simple as that is important for our healing process.
Because we're all in remote communities, If we have to travel to get appointments in Adelaide or at the closest city, then, travel assistance could be also paid for.
I've got a question here around, do you think the change in government in Australia will have an impact on how your stories are listened to now that we have a new government? I'll ask you, Aunty Sue.
We can hope. we can hope that the government will now listen, because the past governments have not listened, they didn't want to know. But we can hope that the new government will listen and talk to the people and try and do things like what Mia's just suggested to help out. We are remote, and if we need to travel to Adelaide for medical reasons, we need help. We don't very often get that. You know, financially, we don't have it. But
I think our government, I think there are way too many powerful senators and Aboriginal people stepping up and having strong voices that I think our government don't really have a choice. They're going to have to listen and act.
I agree, absolutely, Mia. I think it's really important. There is hope that a new government like, you know, Albanese and his team, we have an Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Affairs as well. We're hoping that we can be sitting at the table and having these conversations with you as well, that we are actually being part and involved in those conversations, because it's our stories that have driven the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It is our lived experience and our stories that have really worked hard on this campaign that's been around for over a decade now, with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. It is time that government do sit down and listen with us, who are survivors of what has happened over decades as well.
Our government should feel proud that a stance like prohibiting nuclear weapons, like no one in the world wants a nuclear weapon to land on them. So, I mean, this is amazing, and Australia should be proud that this is where it came from, and they should be supporting it 100%.
Absolutely. What are the risks with so many nuclear weapons still in the world? You know, we know, and we all know, that there are 9 nuke nations across this globe who still play and spend quite large amounts of money into developing these nuclear weapons. What are the risks with so many nuclear weapons still in the world, Aunty Sue?
you only need one person to go ahead and decide that they want to rule the world. And a nuclear weapon could be set off. But, like if that happens, what are they going to rule? There'll be nothing there. It'll be all destroyed because the nuclear weapon has hit it. That they should just stop, think of their own people, think of their own children and their next generations, not just now. Stop and think about the future and just say, right, we don't need it, stop. Everybody sign, get rid of it. Just stop.
If we all stand together and it is ratified, there is no fear. We can't fear the people that do own it.
Yeah.
Or are threatening to use it.
Yeah, well, I don't fear them anyway because I just don't.
I think there's a lot of hard yards ahead of us for those of us that are involved in this work. The treaty, it will take time for the Australian government to work through what it needs to work through. We encourage the Australian government to invite us survivors of these tests that happened in our own country to sit around and be part of the solution as well. And I think we can all work together to make this world a safer place because, as ICANN has always said, nuclear weapons could be the end of us humans and society. So amazing work that has happened over the decades now is the education around what these nuclear weapons could possibly do to us as a human race as well. The Nuclear Ban Treaty sets out the obligations for victim assistance. What do you feel is the most necessary for your communities going forward? I'm going to ask you that, Aunty Sue, because you've been around, you've spoken up strong about this. It looks at the obligations for victim assistance. What do you feel is the most necessary for your community in the Kokatha community?
The distance where our community is from the major hospitals, so assistance, if our mob gets sick, assistance to get them to the specialists in Adelaide. And we are, almost 1,000 kilometres away from the nearest major hospital in Adelaide. And we need help to be able to... When we leave home, we have to pay for every little thing we eat or drink, plus a motel room, we've got to pay the whole way. We need assistance. Maybe there can be some assistance to get the people over for the treatments they need and then back home again. Not just get them over and leave them in the city, which happens. They need to bring them back home again, but yeah.
Research as well is huge within those areas where victims have been impacted as well, and I think it's really important for that to continue on, getting that research to understand how this has impacted on our communities, but also how those who have suffered from this are to get that assistance. And remoteness is a huge issue for us and those who live in remote communities in South Australia. We need the support to be able to get that medical assistance as well. It's really important for us to be able to get that support that is needed for us. And the list is endless. There's so much research, again, that needs to be done in the different areas, whether it's autoimmune disease or whether it is heart disease or whether it's, skin rashes or blindness within our communities. They are all very real illnesses for us in our communities. Perhaps a facility that is closer to those of us that live in those remote communities is something that is also needed for us and those victims.
And don't forget another illness that is hidden, and that's the mental illness that we suffer, the guilt trips and everything else, and maybe a psychologist or something.
That's a really important issue that Aunty Sue's raised around the mental health and impact it has had on our communities, from those who have experienced it, but also for those who are suffering from it as well. The mental support is needed, and that is right across our state of South Australia and in those communities that have been impacted. Does the Australian media cover these issues? Why or why not? And I might ask Mia, as a third-generation survivor, do you feel that Australian media cover these issues?
I think there are some media companies that do. Definitely not enough, and not like for my generation. I think my generation very much on Facebook and Instagram, and you won't see this stuff on there. You might watch it on TV, but a lot of my generation are on Netflix and Prime and Binge. They're not watching TV anymore. They're not watching ABC News. So I think media companies need to get with the times.
ABC News don't cover us anyway. They don't. Sorry.
No, but it's such an important issue, because if media is not covering it, then, how do the community, the broader community, know about these real issues that are having an impact on us as Aboriginal people in our communities? It's important for media to be covering these stories, to bring that greater awareness in the broader community.
Netflix
so
can
people
come make
know.
a documentary.
Today we've gathered and we've really spoken up strong about real important issues that are really close to our heart. Are you worried about plans for nuclear submarines possibly to be built in South Australia, which is a very big concern for us in South Australia? I'll ask you, Aunty Sue, if that's... It's down. Perfect.
I'll give you a signal.
Yep. Okay.
Flowers, which is this dirt desert pea, which is a beautiful flower that flowers through the central desert of Australia, and we have some out the front that you can grab, which have this message that's come from community that's almost. Okay. Maybe we've got you. Karina, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful.
We had a question around our worries and concerns about plans for nuclear submarines that are being planned and possibly built here in South Australia. I was going to ask Aunty Sue if you could share your thoughts on this.
Nuclear submarines, I think really nuclear enough. We don't need you. We don't need your submarines. We just don't need nuclear. Please go away if that's possible. But no, I know there's plans to build nuclear submarines in South Australia. Go and ask the people that live next to these places that's going to build them. How's the uranium or the nuclear going to get to the submarines? They're going to be nuclear powered. Where is it going to come from? How's it going to travel to them? What's the nuclear highways? What's the dangers of any kind of accident to the people? And don't forget the animals that are on the sides of the road as well. Where's the danger? There's got to be danger somewhere.
We've got to ask the question if they're really necessary as well for submarines to be built.
Is it necessary?
Here in South Australia as well. Do you think there should be a way for Indigenous peoples to express support for the treaty independent of settler states? And what do you think that would look like, Aunty Sue?
Settler state means the other Australians, right? The Indigenous people would support the treaty. Here in Port Augusta today, we've had quite a lot of people come along to our earlier meeting, and they all are showing support about banning nuclear weapons. And we can go ahead without the settler states. We don't need them. If they don't want to support no nukes, they can stay behind in their silly little world while we all move forward into a brighter nuclear-free future.
Indigenous peoples need to be around in the discussions and have those conversations, and we need to be sitting around the tables. If we are talking treaty, then we need to be involved in those conversations. I want to wrap up this evening from Port Augusta on one question. We've gathered together as family and friends and family who have travelled far. What did you hear in the community meeting this afternoon? What have been some of the strong messages you've heard from those who have joined us today?
Well, I reckon I could honestly say, join the treaty. We do not want nuclear. Mia?
I have felt this legacy of great-grandmothers to grandmothers to our present, and then my babies. So just this whole legacy that is carried through, I feel really proud that I'm coming through strong women, that went before me. Yeah, I think that's been amazing. And that they have fought so strong back then, and that the fight is still going, that you guys, everything that my great-grandmothers all fought for and spoke about and tried to educate their younger ones about, it's been amazing, and it's still going through, and that their fight was worth it.
Absolutely. Australia sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you, Vienna, for this opportunity. It's been an honour coming live from Port Augusta.